guys, Rye here. For emergency preparedness, I know one of the most important factors is to be familiar with gear and skills before the need arises. So I decided to take some of our gear out to the woods and practice using it. Watch as I give it a try. We went camping multiple times this summer. I try to look for campsites that have enough room to be organized into different areas, like a sleeping area, cooking area, a spot for our hammocks, and a spot to put up a shade tent, since that's likely what I would need in a long-term situation. I always set up our tent as the first thing in a new site, since shelter is one of the most critical factors of outdoor survival. Our tent is pretty easy to set up. The first night is always pretty quiet since we try to pick up a meal on the way in to avoid having to cook. I always start the morning with a warm drink, usually hot chocolate. It's just so tasty. I tried to keep our meals simple this summer on all these trips, since refrigeration is limited all the time, but it would be especially limited in an apocalypse. Eggs straight from the chicken are shelf-stable and can generally be abundant with a good flock. Obviously, they're also a classic breakfast, but what really matters is getting a good amount of protein to start the day. I set up this easy hand washing station for camping. It's a dark jug of water, which lets the sun heat the water slightly throughout the day. This bag is so useful since even small slivers of soap end up getting all stuck together inside to use every last bit. I try to always get a campsite by a river for good running water that can be purified, and in emergencies, it should provide easier access to smaller wildlife for food. We made soup from a dehydrated mix one night for dinner. I try to have dried soup in our food storage since it takes up less space and just needs water. Dried soup is also something that you could make in a long-term emergency scenario. We made a nice little Dutch oven cobbler for a treat, and so I could practice some easy campfire cooking. Obviously, not all these ingredients would be available in these forms in an emergency, but you could have canned and dried goods in storage, and fresh fruit in a garden, and substitute water for the soda. The butter would require a dairy cow though. I guess I might need a farm to be completely prepared. It turned out perfectly, even with only a few coals on top. Pancakes could definitely be made in the apocalypse, but would not be nearly this easy. That's probably the case for any breads really, since flour requires farming grains of some kind and then processing. So I guess that's probably something that would really be better to have in those emergency food storage cans that last like 25 years. All the other ingredients would require canned goods or farming as well: sugar, milk, eggs. It's always satisfying to me seeing befores and afters of a camp, and returning nature to its previous state. The thunderstorms were crazy the whole time we camped. It was seriously so wet and humid every time we went out, even if there was little to no rain in the forecast. I loved seeing all the critters around the campsites. Chipmunks look so funny when they eat. This was the freakiest caterpillar I've ever seen. We tried cooking meat on the fire pit during the rain, since you gotta eat rain or shine. I built the fire to the side a bit so the pan would cover it from the rain. It wasn't too bad of an experience. but the meat overcooked from how hot we made the fire to outlast the rain. That's probably why you're supposed to cook over coals and not active flame. The thunder was so intense. The rain lasted until we left. We tried doing more bushcraft type things on our last trip for the summer. One of the biggest differences in how people approach bushcraft is their shelter. There are lots of different types of shelters you can make depending on your environment and supplies and needs. Some shelters use just a tarp attached to stakes, some attached to trees, some dig into the ground and tent the tarp above the hole. Lots of survivalist YouTubers make videos for all the different types, and I understand the premise of most of them, but since I was camping in man-made campgrounds this summer, I didn't want to do anything that would break the rules or change the environment too much. So I made a hammock shelter under a tarp. Basically, the hammock should be fully off the ground for this type, and then the tarp should be just above the hammock. I did string it a little high for convenience for this trip, with the edges of the tarp farther out to the side since the weather was supposed to be okay, but that proved false yet again. It still kept the hammock mostly dry, besides the straps. I lived out of the emergency bag for this trip, with the exception of the food. So I used the metal camp stove and cook set to boil water for multiple meals. It was relatively easy to set up, but these fuel tabs did not want to light. It was weird. Oatmeal is a pretty standard dry good for emergency scenarios since it's pretty basic and edible with just cooking and water. Of course, I used pre-flavored ones with spices and dried fruit, which is even tastier and still doable in the apocalypse. This little guy was very interested in our green car. These sandwiches specifically are a bit of a cheat since they have mayonnaise in them, but overall sandwiches are a pretty basic survival staple. The river showed just how much the storm raged. Look how dirty it got. I practiced using a regular fire with the camp stove as well. It didn't work as well as the fuel tab since the heat was more uneven, but it still got the job done and cooked this mac and cheese. Pasta would be a bit tricky in an apocalypse, again because of the flour, so I think I better make sure I have a bunch of that on hand, because I love breads. Roasting meat over a fire is pretty standard, although I doubt there'd be hot dogs at that point. Popcorn would be doable if you had enough dried corn kernels. And luckily there are fields and fields of corn around here, so it'd be enough to collect to be able to add to your farm if needed. If you have sugar and vanilla and gelatin, and I won't tell you the tragedy of how to get gelatin in the apocalypse, then you could make marshmallows at that point. But apparently dry gelatin powder is indefinitely shelf stable, if you can keep it dry. So maybe just stock up on that and leave the farm animals alone. I feel like this was a valuable way to spend some of my free time this summer. I practiced using all of our supplies and learned about shelters. I got to make lots of fires and think about food storage a lot. I think everyone should rough it every once in a while, if only to appreciate what they have. Thanks for watching!